Yesterday, we tried to characterize the forces that permeated Greece and Rome in order to obtain an idea of the influences that have been carried over from the 4th into the 5th post-Atlantean age, and we gave some indication of where we have to look today for signs of continued activity of the forces of the 4th post-Atlantean age. I want to ask you now to turn your attention once again to our description of the civilizations of Greece and Rome. In the way it developed, the civilization of Greece was a source of great disappointment to the Luciferic powers. One can, of course, only say these things out of imaginative cognition, and this will also be true of what is to be presented to you today. The development of Greek civilization was a great disappointment to the Luciferic powers because they expected something quite different from it. Think what this means. They had expected the civilization of Greece, the 4th epoch of post-Atlantean times, to bring into being for them all they had striven for during Atlantean times. On Atlantis they had developed certain activities, certain influences and forces, and they had expected to see the fruits of their labors appear in the 4th post-Atlantean epoch. What was it they were really looking for? To speak of such a matter, lets us look right into the Luciferic soul. We come to know this Luciferic life that continually strives, hoping that certain results may ensue, but that continually meets with fresh disappointment. A logician would naturally ask, why do not these Luciferic powers stop trying? Why do they not see that they must be forever and repeatedly disappointed? Such a conclusion would be human, not Luciferic, wisdom. At any rate, the Luciferic powers have yet to come to this conclusion. On the contrary, it is their practice to redouble their efforts whenever they experience disappointment. What was it, then, that the Luciferic powers expected from this 4th post-Atlantean age? They wanted to obtain mastery of all the soul forces of the Greek people, those soul forces that were, as we have seen, directed to carrying over the ancient imaginations of the Chaldean Egyptian period, and to incorporate them into the creations of their own fantasy. The Luciferic powers made it their endeavor to work so strongly on the human beings of the Greek civilization that their imaginations, refined and distilled to fantasy, should fill their whole being. The Greeks would then have lost themselves in a soul world, in an everyday thinking, feeling and willing that would have consisted entirely of those subtle imaginations that had become complete fantasy. If the Greeks had developed nothing in their souls but these imaginations refined to fantasy, if these enticing imaginations had come to fill their souls completely, the Luciferic powers would have been able to lift the Greeks and a great part of humanity out of human evolution to place them in their own Luciferic world. This was the intention of the Luciferic powers. From the Atlantean epoch on, it had been their hope to achieve in the 4th post-Atlantean age what they had failed to do in Atlantis. Humanity, at the stage it had then reached, would have been incorporated into the cosmos. They wanted nothing less than to create for themselves a separate world where earthly gravity did not exist, but where human beings would dwell with absolute super-sensible lightness, entirely given up to a life of fantasy. It was the hope of the Luciferic beings to create a planetary body, which would contain those members of humanity who had reached this highest development of the fantasy life. They made every endeavor to lead the souls of the Greeks away from the earth. Had they succeeded, these souls would gradually have forsaken the earth. The bodies that still came to birth would have been degenerate. Egoless beings would have been born, the earth would have fallen into decadence, and a special Luciferic kingdom would have begun. This did not come to pass. Why? This condition did not come about because, mingled with the self-deifying madness of Greek poetry, to quote Plato, was the genius and greatness of Greek philosophy and wisdom. The Greek philosophers Heraclitus, Thales, Anaximenes, Anaximander, Parmenides, Socrates, Plato and Aristotle saved Greek civilization from being completely spiritualized in a life of fantasy. They kept the Greeks on earth, providing the strongest forces that kept Greece within earthly evolution. In considering the course of history, we must always take into account the forces that lie behind physical reality, and are the true causes of all that happens. It was, then, in this way that Greece was preserved for earthly evolution. Now, the Luciferic beings would have been unable to achieve anything at all without the help of the Ahrimanic beings. in all their intentions and hope they reckoned on their support. Indeed, it must always be that two forces strive together in this kind of working. Just as the Luciferic beings were disappointed in Greece, so were the Ahrimanic beings disappointed in Rome and the way it developed. The Luciferic beings wanted to lead Grecian souls away from the Earth planet, and the Ahrimanic beings wanted to contribute their efforts to the end that the Roman civilization would assume a particular form. The Ahrimanic beings exerted their strongest efforts in Rome, just as the Luciferic beings did in Greece. They calculated that a certain hardening would arise on Earth brought about by an entirely blind obedience and subjection to Rome. What did the Ahrimanic powers want to accomplish in Rome? They wanted to establish a Roman Empire that would extend over the whole of the then known world, embracing within it every human activity. It would be directed entirely from Rome with the strictest centralization and the utmost development of the rule of might. They sought to establish a widely flung state machinery that would include and make subject to it all religious and artistic life. Its goal would be to stamp out all individuality. Every people and human being would comprise merely some small part of this mighty state machine. Thanks to the clarity of its philosophers, however, Greece was not lulled into the Luciferic dream, nor could Rome be hardened as these Ahrimanic powers desired, because in Rome, too, something was working against them. This was described in the last lecture as Roman ideals, but the legal, political, and military ideals that were then developing could not have withstood Ahriman alone. Within the Roman civilization, the Ahrimanic powers gathered for a stupendous onslaught. That attempt was like a repetition of their attempt made in Atlantean times, and it developed infinitely strong powers and forces. It was only from another side that Ahriman's intention was hindered. It was, at first, prevented by something that, at first sight, might be regarded as a lower trait in the Roman character, but that was not the case. As a matter of fact, the Romans had need of what I may have seemed to describe in the last lecture with some antipathy. They needed their ruthlessness, stubborn egoism, that continuous stirring up of emotions, to be able to march against the Ahrimanic powers. Roman history, I beg you expressly to note this, is not a revelation of the Ahrimanic powers. Although they stand in the background, it is a fight against them. If it is all confused and self-seeking, seeming to tend more and more toward a politicalization of the whole world, it is because only in this way could Ahriman's mechanizing be resisted. All this alone, however, would not have been of much avail. Rome had also received Christianity, which in Rome would have assumed a form that would have given Ahriman a splendid opportunity to achieve his aims since, through the spiritual decline of a Roman rule that had been transformed into a papacy, the mechanizing of culture could have been accomplished. So another external power had to be brought against Ahriman, who works with much more external means than Lucifer. Ahriman, as we have seen, diverted the forces of Christianity to his own service. Another power had to be brought against him. This was the onslaught of the Germanic tribes caused by the migration of peoples in Europe. Through this onslaught on Rome, the mechanizing of the world under a single, all-embracing Roman Empire was hindered. If you will study all that took place in the migration of these peoples, you will find that you can get a true insight into it when you see it from this point of view. Whenever the migration of peoples occurs in the Roman world, Roman history is not thereby brought to an end, but the Ahrimanic powers, combated throughout their history by the Romans, are repelled. Thus did Ahriman meet with his disappointment, as Lucifer had met with his. But they will take up their tasks again in the fifth post-Atlantean age with all the more determination. Here is the point at which we must gain an understanding of the forces that are operative in our age, insofar as such an understanding is possible today. The fourth post-Atlantean age extends both backwards and forwards from its central point in 333 AD. It ended about 1413 AD, and it began about 747 BC. These are, of course, approximate dates. I have just told you that the disappointment of Lucifer and Ahriman in the forms the Greek and Roman civilizations had assumed has led them to make still stronger efforts in our fifth post-Atlantean age. Their efforts are already at work in the human forces that have been active from the 15th century. It does not matter whether something occurs a few decades earlier or later. In outer physical reality, which takes on the form of the great illusion, things are sometimes misplaced. The fact that the Roman civilization could be retained in the evolution of humanity, as it was due to the events brought about by the migrations of the peoples. If Rome had developed in such a way that a great all-embracing mechanized empire had arisen, it would only have been habitable for egoless human beings who would have remained on earth after Lucifer had drawn out their souls on the path of Greek culture and art. You see how Ahriman and Lucifer work together. Lucifer wants to take men's souls away and found a planet with them of his own. Ahriman has to help him. While Lucifer sucks the juice out of the lemon, as it were, Ahriman presses it out, thereby hardening what remains. This is what he tried to do to the civilization of Rome. Here we have an important cosmic process going on, all due to the intention and resolve of Luciferic and Ahrimanic powers. As I have said, they were disappointed. They have continued their efforts, however, and our fifth post-Atlantean age has yet to learn how strong these attacks are. They are now only beginning, but they will become stronger and stronger.